Comrades, what if I told you that the foundations of the society in which you toil, sweat, and bend yourselves to exhaustion are built not upon justice, not upon merit, but upon a precise and calculated robbery, a robbery so normalized that the oppressed have learned to accept it as natural law? Today, we tear the mask off this deception. Today, we expose the hidden machinery through which the ruling class measures, extracts, and magnifies the degree of exploitation of labor power. For too long, those who produce everything have possessed nothing, while those who produce nothing have possessed everything. This is no accident. It is the central mechanism of the economic order under which we live. The worker enters the factory with only one commodity, labor power, yet the moment this commodity is purchased, it is consumed in a manner unlike any other. It creates value greater than its own cost. That difference, unpaid, unacknowledged, forcibly taken, is the lifeblood of the system that oppresses you. The masters of capital speak of fairness, of wages freely agreed upon, of opportunity for all. But what is this freedom when one class owns the tools, the land, the machines, and the very conditions of life itself, while the other must sell its energy merely to survive? There is no freedom in necessity. There is no equality in contracts forged under the pressure of hunger. The wage is not a measure of worth, it is a measure of domination. Here lies the truth. The working day is divided into two parts. One part pays for your own subsistence, your food, your shelter, your ability to return tomorrow. The other part produces surplus value, value that does not belong to you, value that is taken by those who did not lift a single brick, turn a single gear, or strike a single blow. This unpaid labor hidden behind wages, cloaked behind ideology, wrapped in the deceitful language of employment, is the cornerstone of exploitation. The ruling class extends the working day not because society demands it, but because exploitation demands it. They intensify labor not for progress, but for profit. They introduce new technologies not to lighten your burden, but to deepen their control. At every turn, their goal is singular: extract more surplus while giving less in return. Comrades, understand this clearly. The degree of exploitation is not an academic formula. It is the measure of your dispossession. It is the ratio between your life and their greed. It is the number of hours each day in which you live as a free human, and the hours in which you live as a tool for another's enrichment. But the exploiters tremble at one truth they cannot extinguish. The labor that builds the world can also stop the world. This is why they divide you by trade, by race, by nationality, by every artificial boundary they can create. For they know that the day you recognize your shared condition, the day you see yourselves as one class instead of scattered individuals, the chains that bind you will shatter. Workers, the time has come to reclaim your stolen hours, your stolen value, your stolen lives. Do not wait for benevolence from those who profit from your misery. Do not trust reforms that are engineered to preserve power. The liberation of labor will not descend from above. It will rise from below, from your collective strength, your organized force, your unbreakable unity. Let the factories resound with your voice, not with your silence. Let the fields, the workshops, the mines, the offices become battlegrounds of consciousness. Let every worker know that to challenge exploitation is not merely your right, it is your historical duty. For when the exploited rise, they do not merely reclaim their wages, they reclaim their humanity. And when a class united in purpose moves against a system built on theft, that system has no future. Comrades, the hour is urgent, the struggle is clear. The path is before you. Stand together, organize, revolt against the arithmetic of exploitation, transform society at its roots, and build a world in which labor is no longer a commodity, but the expression of liberated human beings. The future belongs to those who produce it. To grasp the essence of modern society, one must cut through the noise of political rhetoric, cultural distraction, and economic mystification, and confront a single, undeniable truth. The entire edifice of capitalism rests upon the extraction of unpaid labor from the working class. This is not a marginal detail, not an accidental injustice, not the result of individual immorality. It is the central mechanism of the system, its heartbeat, its motive force, its secret engine of accumulation. The worker enters the labor market with only one commodity to sell: labor power. It is a unique commodity because, unlike tools or raw materials, it has the capacity to create value. But this extraordinary ability becomes the very foundation of exploitation. When labor power is purchased, the worker is paid a wage that reflects merely the cost of sustaining life, food, shelter, clothing, and the bare means to return to work the next day. Yet what the worker produces during the working day far exceeds the value of this wage. The time spent reproducing the cost of living is only a fraction of the labor performed. Beyond that lies surplus labor, the portion of the working day in which the worker creates value that is not compensated, not acknowledged, not returned. This surplus labor is unpaid labor, and it is here, precisely here, that exploitation takes its most concentrated form. The employer appears to pay for labor, but in truth, the wage only covers the maintenance of the worker's existence, not the full value they produce. A few hours may suffice to reproduce the value of the wage, but the working day is extended far beyond those hours. Everything produced during this extended period becomes surplus value, appropriated entirely by the owners of capital. It is not merely a matter of profit, it is a matter of ownership over the fruits of another's effort, ownership secured by the structural arrangement of the economic system. Thus, unpaid labor is not a moral flaw, it is an economic law. It is not a mistake within capitalism, it is the very condition of its survival. Without surplus value, accumulation would cease. Without accumulation, capital would wither. Thus the system must perpetually intensify the extraction of unpaid labor by lengthening the working day, by accelerating the pace of work, by introducing machinery not to lighten human toil, but to extend the reach of capital's command over time. Consider the modern factory, the office, the workshop, the call center, the gig platform. In every case, the wage worker gives more than they receive, produces more than they are paid for, and advances the wealth of the few while struggling to meet the needs of life. The glitter of commodities, the apparent freedom of exchange, and the propaganda of opportunity only conceal the underlying reality. The worker is compelled to produce value they will never touch. The exploiters speak of fair wages, contracts, and market rates, but these terms serve only to disguise the essence of the transaction. The appearance of equality in the exchange between worker and employer is an illusion. The worker must sell labor power to survive. The capitalist buys it to exploit it. The balance of power is already decided before the contract is signed. Necessity forces the worker's hand. Ownership strengthens the capitalists. Unpaid labor does not merely enrich the owners of capital, it shapes society itself. It builds their mansions, funds their institutions, expands their influence, and cements their dominance. Every monument of wealth stands as a testament to countless hours of invisible, uncompensated human effort. The lives of the ruling class are woven from the unrecorded, unacknowledged sacrifices of millions who create without possessing, build without benefiting, and sustain without being sustained. And yet, the system depends entirely on those it exploits. The worker's unpaid labor is both the source of wealth and the potential source of its undoing. For when the working class becomes conscious of the reality of exploitation not as an abstract concept, but as a daily theft embedded in every hour of work, the foundations of capital begin to tremble. The realization that unpaid labor is the source of their oppression is the first step toward liberation. To expose unpaid labor is to expose the system itself. To understand it is to understand the world in which we live, and to challenge it is to challenge the domination of one class over another. Unpaid labor is the core source of exploitation and the key to revolutionary transformation. To understand the true nature of exploitation within the capitalist order, one must first understand the hidden structure of the working day. What appears as a simple stretch of hours, agreed upon, scheduled, and compensated, conceals a profound division. This division separates the time in which the worker reproduces the value of their own livelihood from the time in which they create value for those who command the means of production. These two parts, necessary labour and surplus labour, form the backbone of economic domination and the secret of accumulation. Necessary labour refers to the portion of the working day in which the worker produces value equivalent to the wage they receive. It is the time needed to reproduce their capacity to live, the food they consume, the clothing they wear, the shelter they inhabit, and the conditions that allow them to return the next morning to sell their labour power once again. In other words, during necessary labour, the worker produces only enough to maintain themselves as a worker within the system. The wage is not a payment for the whole day, it is a payment only for this minimum period, the period that ensures the continuity of labour power as a commodity. But the working day does not end there. It stretches far beyond the boundaries of necessary labour. Once the worker has produced the value equal to the wage, everything they produce afterward becomes surplus labour, labour that generates value which does not return to the worker in any form. It is absorbed entirely by the owners of capital, converted into profit, and used to expand their wealth, influence, and command over society. Surplus labour is the foundation of exploitation, for it is unpaid labour disguised within the routines of the day. This division between necessary and surplus labour is not a natural division, it is a product of the economic relations that define the modern world. The worker is compelled to sell their labour power to survive, while the capitalist purchases it to extract surplus. The length of the working day, therefore, becomes a site of struggle between the worker, who seeks to minimize the hours they must give, and the capitalist, who seeks to extend them to the greatest degree possible. Historically, this struggle over the working day has shaped social movements, laws, and revolutions. It is not merely a conflict over hours, but over the distribution of human life itself. For every hour the working day extends beyond necessary labour, the worker's time is taken for the enrichment of another. The capitalist does not pay for this time, they appropriate it. Every additional minute of surplus labour becomes a minute of unpaid exploitation. The capitalist has an unrelenting drive to lengthen surplus labour because it is the source of surplus value, the lifeblood of profit. To achieve this, various strategies are employed. The working day is lengthened directly through extended hours. Labour is intensified by increasing the pace of work, thereby extracting more surplus in the same amount of time. New technologies are introduced not to ease the worker's burden but to maximize the extraction of surplus labor by accelerating production beyond the limits of human endurance. On the surface, wages seem to compensate the worker fairly. But a deeper look reveals that the wage is only the monetary expression of necessary labor, not a payment for the full duration of work. The illusion of equality in the wage contract masks the unequal exchange. The worker gives labour power for a full day, while the capitalist pays only for a fraction of it. In this simple transaction lies the entire secret of accumulation, the transformation of surplus labour into capital. The consequences of this division shape every aspect of society. The luxuries of the ruling class, the expansion of industries, the monuments of wealth, all rise from the surplus labour extracted daily from millions. The working class reproduces not only its own existence, but the existence of the system that exploits it. They sustain the very power that denies them control over their own lives. Yet within this same division lies the potential for emancipation. When workers understand that the working day is not a neutral measure of time, but a battlefield, they recognize that their struggle is not for higher wages alone, but for control over the hours of their own lives. The reduction of surplus labor, the reclaiming of time, and the dismantling of the structures that enforce this division become paths toward liberation. The working day is divided into necessary labor and surplus labor, not by nature, but by the relations of power. To expose this division is to expose the architecture of exploitation. To challenge it is to strike at the heart of the system that thrives upon the unpaid hours of the many for the wealth of the few. In the daily exchange between worker and employer, few illusions are as powerful, as enduring, or as deceptive as the wage. It appears as a fair reward for labour performed, a compensation freely agreed upon between equal parties. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. The wage is not a measure of justice, nor a reflection of the worker's real contribution to society. Rather, It is a veil, a carefully woven mask that conceals the true magnitude of domination and inequality embedded in the structure of capitalist production. The wage obscures the fact that what the worker truly sells is not labor itself, but labor power, the capacity to work. This distinction is crucial, for once labor power becomes the property of the employer, its use is governed not by the needs of the worker, but by the interests of capital. The capitalist purchases labor power at its cost of reproduction, just enough to sustain the worker's existence, while appropriating far more value from the worker's actual labor than the wage represents. The wage, therefore, does not compensate the worker for the total value produced. It compensates only for the minimum required to keep the worker alive and available for further exploitation. This is the first mask, the illusion of fairness. The wage appears to reflect the value of work completed, but in reality it hides the unpaid labor that forms the foundation of profit. It disguises the extraction of surplus value, the portion of the day in which the worker creates wealth that they will never receive, wealth that is seized entirely by the owners of capital. The wage gives the impression that the worker has been fully compensated, when in truth they have been compensated only for a fraction of what they create. But there is a second mask, the illusion of equality. The wage contract presents the worker and employer as free individuals entering a voluntary agreement. Yet the worker's freedom is a freedom conditioned by necessity. They must sell labor, power, or starve. The employer, owning the means by which life can be sustained, enters the contract from a position of dominance. This structural inequality is hidden behind the polite language of employment, as though hunger and ownership did not dictate the terms under which labor power is sold. The wage further conceals the fact that the worker is subordinated not simply during the act of labor but in life as a whole. The wage determines access to housing, education, health, and even leisure conditions the worker has no real control over. By reducing human existence to a monetary figure, the wage transforms the worker into a cost, a line on a balance sheet, a replaceable component in a system driven by accumulation. The inequality between those who labor and those who command labor is far greater than the numbers printed on a paycheck can ever reveal. Even more insidious is the ideological mask created by wages, the notion that poverty, hardship, or insecurity result from individual failure rather than from structural exploitation. The worker is told to work harder, improve skills, or seek better opportunities, as though the system were neutral and inequality a natural outcome of merit. This narrative obscures the fact that no amount of effort can overcome the structural reality that wages are designed to be less than the value produced. The system requires inequality to function. The wage merely hides it behind personal responsibility. The wage also obscures the collective nature of labor. It fragments workers into isolated individuals, each receiving a separate payment for what appears to be their personal contribution. But no worker produces in isolation. Production is social. It depends on cooperation, shared effort, and interconnected tasks. The wage conceals this collective foundation, turning solidarity into competition and transforming fellow workers into rivals for survival. Behind the wage stands the towering inequality between classes, between those who own and those who must sell. The wage hides the fact that wealth flows upward, accumulating in the hands of those who do not labor, who merely possess. It disguises the power that comes from ownership and the powerlessness that arises from dispossession. It creates the illusion that society is held together by fairness, when in reality it is held together by the domination of one class over another. To expose the wage is to expose the economic order itself. Once workers understand that the wage does not liberate them but binds them, that it hides exploitation rather than eliminating it, the mask begins to fall. The wage, instead of appearing as a gift or a reward, is revealed as a mechanism through which inequality is reproduced daily, hour after hour, in every factory, office, field, and workshop. Wages mask the true degree of domination and inequality, but only as long as the working class remains unaware. When consciousness breaks through the illusion, the wage becomes not a symbol of fairness, but a symbol of the system that must be transcended. To understand the relentless motion of the capitalist system, the reason it expands without limit, devours resources without restraint, and grinds down human bodies without hesitation, one must return to the essential motive that animates it, the pursuit of surplus value. Every action of capital, every reform it promotes, every technology it deploys, every demand it imposes on the working class is driven not by a regard for human welfare, not by a desire for progress in any noble sense, but by the cold and calculated aim of increasing surplus labour and thereby enlarging surplus value. Surplus value is the unpaid labour appropriated by the owners of capital. It is the difference between what the worker receives as wages and what the worker actually produces. This difference is the lifeblood of capital, the source of profit, accumulation, growth, and domination. Because surplus value is created only through labour, capital's very survival depends upon the extraction of ever more surplus labour from the working class. This is the foundation of its restless, insatiable character. To increase surplus value, capital employs two fundamental strategies: intensifying labour and extending labour. Intensification of labour means increasing the pace, pressure, and demands placed upon the worker during each hour of the working day. It involves reorganizing tasks, accelerating machinery, reducing pauses, tightening supervision, and introducing methods that push workers to produce more in the same amount of time. The worker's body and mind become battlegrounds on which capital wages a war for every minute, every movement, every breath. Under intensification, exhaustion is not an accident, it is the intended outcome. The worker is stretched to the limits of endurance so that more value can be extracted without increasing wages. The introduction of machinery is often celebrated as a triumph of human ingenuity, yet in the hands of capital it becomes a weapon. Machines do not free workers, they bind them more tightly to the rhythms of production. They dictate pace, enforce discipline, and compel the worker to follow mechanical precision under constant threat of being replaced. Far from easing labour, machinery amplifies the extraction of surplus labour by speeding up production and reducing the workers' control over their own time. The technological advance that could liberate humanity is twisted into a means of deeper exploitation. Extending labour, the second strategy, is no less brutal. Capital seeks to lengthen the working day beyond the hours required to reproduce the worker's subsistence. Once necessary labour is completed, the remaining hours become pure surplus labour hours of unpaid work. Throughout history, the ruling class has pushed to stretch the working day to its absolute physical limit, forcing workers into dawn-to-dusk toil, night shifts, and endless cycles in which the difference between life and labour disappears. The longer the working day, the more surplus value flows upward into the hands of those who own the means of production. Even when legal limits curb the length of the working day, capital finds ways around them. Shift systems are reorganized, rest periods shortened, flexibility imposed, and new forms of precarious employment created. The gig worker, the contract laborer, the outsourced employee all experience extensions of labor disguised as freedom. They are compelled to remain available at all hours, to accept unpredictable schedules, to stretch their own time in search of survival. The boundaries of the working day blur, expanding not by legal decree but by economic compulsion. The intensification and extension of labor are not aberrations or temporary strategies, they are inherent to the logic of capital. Without increasing surplus labor, capital cannot accumulate. Without accumulation, it faces crisis. Thus it must constantly revolutionize production, reshape labor processes, deepen control, and expand exploitation. It must transform every improvement into a means of greater extraction. Even social gains, reduced hours, safer conditions, improved tools are quickly reabsorbed and turned toward the same end, the expansion of surplus value. This compulsion transforms society as a whole. The pressure to increase surplus value reorganizes institutions, reshapes education, dictates technological development, and governs political decisions. Workers are trained not to think, but to produce, not to question, but to obey. Public life is subordinated to private profit, and human needs are sacrificed to the hunger for accumulation. Even time outside work becomes preparation for work, rest reduced to recovery, leisure commodified, relationships reshaped by exhaustion. Yet the very strategies capital employs carry the seeds of resistance. The more labor is intensified, the more unbearable conditions become. The more the working day is extended, the more clearly exploitation is revealed. In pushing workers beyond their limits, capital exposes its own brutality and lays bare the contradiction at the heart of the system, that wealth grows only through the impoverishment of those who create it. Capital intensifies and extends labor not for progress, not for humanity, and not for the common good. It does so for one purpose alone, to extract more surplus value. And in this pursuit, it reveals the necessity of struggle, the urgency of organization, and the inevitability of a world beyond exploitation. The history of all oppressed classes teaches one lesson with unbroken clarity. Those who labor in isolation remain powerless, but those who unite become an unstoppable force capable of reshaping society. The working class, divided by occupation, scattered across industries, fragmented by artificial boundaries of race, nationality, and culture, is held in subordination only because its collective strength remains untapped. To reclaim what has been taken its time, its dignity, its share in the wealth it creates, it must rise not as individuals, but as a unified class conscious of its purpose and power. The ruling class understands this truth far better than the workers themselves. This is why it invests so heavily in maintaining division. It cultivates competition among workers, pits the employed against the unemployed, glorifies individual success stories to disguise collective misery, and nurtures illusions that survival is a matter of personal effort rather than structural injustice. A divided workforce is a manageable workforce. A united one threatens the very pillars of the economic order. The power of the workers lies in the fact that they produce everything, that nothing moves without their hands, their minds, and their labor. Capital owns the machinery, the factories, the offices, the fields, but without labor, these stand silent and useless. Every beam of steel raised, every road paved, every machine assembled, every harvest gathered, every service rendered, these are the products of human effort, not of ownership. The moment workers recognize that society depends entirely upon their activity, the facade of power constructed by the ruling class begins to crumble. Yet recognition alone is not enough. The working class must organize. Organization transforms scattered struggles into coordinated movement. It turns complaints into demands, demands into campaigns, and campaigns into victories. It provides structure, discipline, and direction. It allows workers to defend themselves against exploitation, to protect gains won through hard struggle, and to advance new forms of economic and social life built on cooperation rather than domination. But true organization is more than formal associations or temporary alliances. It requires the growth of class consciousness, an understanding that workers share not only similar hardships but a common enemy in the structure of exploitation itself. It demands the realization that their struggle is not merely against long hours, low wages, or unfair treatment, but against the system that produces these injustices. When workers grasp that their oppression is collective, their movement becomes unstoppable. Resistance is the practical expression of this unity and organization. Resistance takes many forms, asserting rights, challenging unjust conditions, refusing to be silenced. It is the act of standing against exploitation, of refusing to accept as natural what has been imposed by economic power. Through resistance, workers confront the structures that deny them control over their own labor and lives. Resistance does not demand violence. It demands steadfastness, solidarity, courage, and coordinated effort. It is the refusal to surrender humanity to the rhythms of profit. The ruling class fears resistance born of unity because it exposes the fragility of their authority. They know that once workers begin to act together, the imbalance of power that sustains exploitation can no longer be maintained. This is why every act of unity is met with attempts at suppression, why efforts to organize are monitored, discouraged, or punished, why resistance is labeled disruptive, why demands for fairness are dismissed as unrealistic. These reactions reveal the anxiety of those who benefit from the existing order. In reclaiming their stolen power, workers reclaim more than economic rights, they reclaim their dignity. They reclaim the ability to make decisions about their own labor, to shape the conditions of their existence, to contribute consciously to the direction of society rather than serving as mere instruments of accumulation. They reclaim the time that has been taken from them, the voice that has been silenced, and the potential that has been suppressed. The path to reclaiming this power begins wherever workers choose to stand together. In workplaces, in communities, in movements that assert the value of human life over profit. Every act of unity weakens the chains of exploitation. Every instance of organization builds the foundation for a different future. Every expression of resistance signals the awakening of a class long subdued by necessity. The working class has always held the power to transform society. It has only lacked the awareness of that power. When unity replaces division, when organization replaces fragmentation, when resistance replaces resignation, the system that feeds on their labor begins to tremble. Workers must unite, organize, and resist, not as an option, but as a necessity, for in their collective strength lies the possibility of a world where labor is no longer exploited, but liberated. Comrades, we have torn away the illusions that cloak this system and laid bare the brutal reality beneath. We have exposed how unpaid labor forms the cornerstone of exploitation, how the working day is carved into necessary and surplus labor to extract the very lifeblood of the working class, how wages serve as a mask to conceal domination and inequality, and how capital relentlessly intensifies and extends labor solely to enlarge its own power. At every stage, the worker's effort is seized, transformed, and returned as chains. But from this analysis arises not despair but purpose. For the system draws its strength from division, ignorance, and resignation, while the power of the working class lies in unity, consciousness, and action. The ruling class controls wealth, but the working class controls labor, and without labor, nothing in this world can move, grow, or survive. Thus, the path forward is unmistakable. The workers must reject the illusions that obscure their condition. They must see through the disguises of wages, the false promises of opportunity, and the rhetoric of fairness. They must recognize that their struggles are not individual misfortunes, but collective consequences of a system that thrives on their exploitation. And with this recognition, they must stand together not as isolated laborers, not as divided groups, but as a class bound by shared interests and a common destiny. Unity is not a slogan, it is the instrument of liberation. Organization is not optional, it is the structure of resistance. And resistance is not an act of defiance, it is an act of survival, an affirmation of humanity. The future does not belong to those who hoard wealth or command machines. It belongs to those whose hands build the world, whose labor sustains society, whose struggle shapes history. When workers rise in solidarity, when they refuse to be tools of accumulation, when they reclaim the time, value, and dignity stolen from them, the edifice of exploitation begins to crumble. Comrades, the hour demands courage, the world demands transformation, the workers demand justice. Let the exploited awaken. Let the oppressed unite. Let the working class claim its rightful power. For the moment the workers stand as one, the system that feeds upon them will fall, and a new world, grounded in equality, dignity, and collective freedom, will rise in its place.